A gardener entered a locked greenhouse and was never seen again. No footprints, no broken glass, only a single blood-red rose that bloomed where every other plant had died. And beneath the soil, a secret that had been buried for over 20 years. Welcome to the detective files, where logic meets mystery, and no case stays closed for long. The rain that morning fell in a thin, persistent veil, more mist than downpour, yet enough to blur the outlines of chimneys and steeples across the rooftops of Baker Street. I had just poured the second cup of tea when Holmes, with his dressing gown still draped loosely over his lean frame, stood by the window and muttered, "Have you ever known a rose to defy nature's decay, Watson?" I blinked, still half asleep. "Is this one of your riddles, Holmes? Or merely a poetic turn of phrase?" He turned from the glass, his eyes gleaming with that unmistakable light I had come to associate with mystery. "A telegram from Surrey. A gardener has vanished from a locked greenhouse. No forced entry, no broken glass, no footprints leading in or out. But curiously, one rose, his rarest hybrid, blooms stronger than ever amidst a bed of dying plants. Would you call that poetic, or impossible?" Quote. Before I could answer, Mrs. Hudson entered with a silver tray and the Morning Post. Holmes swept up the letter, scanning it briefly before tossing it aside. "I've already accepted the case. We leave on the noon train to Farncombe." I raised an eyebrow. "You accepted before telling me?" Holmes gave a slight smirk. "I had a feeling you'd find a gardener who disappears from a locked room. Quite impossible to resist." I sighed, finishing my tea. "And here I thought we'd have a quiet week." By the time we boarded the train, the fog had thickened. It clung to the countryside like a veil of secrecy, blurring trees into phantoms and hedgerows into illusions. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet during the journey, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest, eyes distant. "Something troubling you?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "I'm trying to decide whether the gardener disappeared or was never there at all." We arrived at Farncombe by mid-afternoon. The village was the sort of place that seemed untouched by time. Cobblestone streets, ivy-choked cottages, and neighbors who still nodded solemnly at passing carriages. The estate where the mystery unfolded belonged to a retired judge named Sir Reginald Brackenmore, a tall, imposing man with a hooked nose and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much in his lifetime. "I trust you had a pleasant journey," he said, ushering us into the drawing room, though his tone suggested he cared little either way. "Pleasant enough," Holmes replied. "Let's not waste time. The gardener, what was his name? Silas Green, worked for me 15 years, lived in the cottage beside the greenhouse, kept to himself, obsessed with his roses. And when was he last seen? 3 nights ago. He entered the greenhouse shortly before dusk, locked it from the inside, as was his habit. In the morning he was gone." Holmes leaned forward, and the door, still locked from the inside, no broken panes, no signs of struggle. "And what made you call for me, Sir Reginald?" Surely the local constable could have chalked it up to a disappearance. The judge hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he gestured toward the French doors that led to the back garden. "You should see the rose for yourself." We followed him through the fog-drenched lawn to the greenhouse, a glass structure framed in iron, dew-streaked and strangely silent. The smell of soil, wet leaves, and something oddly metallic greeted us as we stepped inside. The plants were all in decay. Leaves yellowed, vines shriveled, all except one. In the center, encased in a bed of rich black soil, stood a single rosebush. Its bloom was blood-red, its petals pristine, its leaves almost glowing with health. "I call it the Crimson Widow," Sir Reginald whispered. Holmes knelt beside the rose, examining the soil, the nearby footprints, or rather the absence of any. "Watson," he said softly, "do you believe a man could vanish into thin air and leave behind only perfection?" I didn't answer, because in that moment, I wasn't entirely sure I didn't. Holmes spent nearly 20 minutes inside the greenhouse, moving silently from one end to the other, like a predator surveying its territory. He tapped gently on the glass panels, crouched to examine the hinges of the iron-framed door, and sniffed the soil beside the rose with theatrical delicacy. Meanwhile, I stood beside Sir Reginald, who seemed visibly uncomfortable with our presence. "Did you open the greenhouse before the constables arrived?" I asked him. "No," he replied. "I summoned them immediately." The lock was intact, They had to remove a glass pane to enter. Any signs of blood? Scuffle? A note, perhaps. Nothing. Only his gloves on the workbench, and that damned rose in full bloom. Holmes exited the structure finally, removing his gloves with a snap. No one exited that door, he said plainly. Not that night. Sir Reginald raised an eyebrow. Then where in God's name did he go? That, Holmes replied, is precisely what we must uncover before the garden gives up any more secrets. We returned to the house, where the judge's housekeeper, a stern woman in her 60s named Mrs. Plymley, offered us tea. She had worked in the household for decades and had known Silas since his arrival. He was quiet, she said, setting down the tray. Didn't talk much, but he was kind. Never missed a day in that greenhouse. He'd go in after supper, stay till long after dark. Did he have any visitors? Holmes asked. Mrs. Plymley hesitated. There was one, now that you mention it. A man in a black coat. Came just a few days before Silas vanished. Never saw his face clearly. He came at night. They argued. Argued, I repeated. About what? Couldn't say. I only heard raised voices through the window. Something about not digging it up. And no more payments. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Did Silas seem frightened afterwards? Holmes asked. Mrs. Plymley nodded slowly. He stayed in the greenhouse longer than usual, wouldn't come out even when I called for supper. When she left the room, Holmes sat back in his chair, eyes shut, fingers steepled. You noticed the iron supports inside the greenhouse, he asked. Of course, I replied, strong enough to resist a bull. And yet there's one panel, to the left of the Crimson Widow, where the frame appears slightly newer. The bolts are polished, recently disturbed. You think someone tampered with the structure. Quote, I think Silas Green was trying to hide something beneath his roses. Something worth modifying the very walls to protect. Before I could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the hallway. The door opened, and a young man entered with muddy boots and flushed cheeks. It was the village constable, George Merrow. Begging your pardon, Sir Reginald, he said, removing his cap. But the gardener's cottage, it's been broken into, windows smashed. And, he paused, swallowing. There's blood on the floor. Holmes rose instantly to the cottage, Watson. We followed the constable across the sodden lawn, past the greenhouse, and toward a small brick cottage with ivy crawling up its weathered facade. One of the front windows was indeed shattered. Glass scattered across the flowerbed below. Inside, the air smelled of rust and decay. A small kitchen, a neatly made bed, and a writing desk, all undisturbed. But beside the fireplace, a dark smear trailed across the wooden floorboards. Holmes knelt, pressing 2 fingers into the blood. Still tacky, he murmured. This isn't 3 days old, Sir Reginald frowned. You mean someone was here? Today. Holmes didn't answer. He stood, moving toward the writing desk. And there, tucked beneath a half-finished letter, he found something extraordinary. A metal key, long, old, and etched with a strange floral emblem. Holmes turned it over in his gloved hand. This, he said softly, is no ordinary key. He stared out the window, where the greenhouse loomed in the distance, its iron walls now shrouded in mist. It's a gate, he whispered, to whatever secret Silas Green was keeping buried beneath that rose. That evening, the air thickened with mist, and a quiet unease settled over the estate like a damp blanket. Holmes requested that we return to the greenhouse once more, this time alone, under cover of darkness, I believe. Whatever Silas was hiding, he said, he intended to retrieve or protect. And someone else has now come to take it. By lantern light we entered the greenhouse again. The air inside was humid, heavy with the scent of damp soil and rotting leaves. Holmes moved with surgical precision. Clearing the space around the Crimson Widow rose with a gardener's delicacy, but a detective's focus. Pass me that trowel, Watson. I handed it over. He began digging gently around the base of the rose, pausing every few inches to study the soil's consistency. It's been disturbed, he muttered. And recently, after a few minutes, the trowel scraped something metallic. Holmes froze. Then carefully, he brushed away the dirt until the full shape revealed itself. It was a small iron box, caked in grime. Ornate, almost like a jewelry case, with the same floral emblem as the key we found earlier. Holmes inserted the key. A faint click echoed in the glasshouse, followed by a long, tense silence. He opened the lid. Inside was not gold nor jewels, but a bundle of folded papers tied with red twine, and a single faded photograph. Holmes lifted the photo first. It showed two young men standing before the same greenhouse, decades younger, perhaps 20 years prior. One was unmistakably a young Silas Green. The other wore a military uniform, face half shadowed. Holmes studied the picture with narrowed eyes. "This," he whispered, "goes further back than any of us imagined." He examined the papers next, carefully untying the twine. Some were official-looking, old property deeds, war pension documents, and a letter written in trembling handwriting. Holmes read it silently, his lips tightening with each line. Finally, he handed it to me. It was a confession, a letter from a soldier named Elias Trigg, dated 1876. In it, Trigg described how, after returning from service in India, he and Silas unearthed something beneath the very foundations of the greenhouse. A box, not theirs, as he wrote, wrapped in oilskin and hidden among the roots of a long-dead tree. The letter ended abruptly with a single line underlined twice. "If this letter is found, then I have failed to keep it buried." Holmes folded the papers carefully, returning them to the box. "We're dealing not with a simple disappearance," he said, "but with a secret buried for over 20 years. And someone else now knows it exists." A sharp sound interrupted us, glass crunching underfoot. We spun around, lantern beam flicking across the greenhouse shadows. Someone was outside. Holmes motioned for silence. We crept toward the door, but by the time we emerged, only the wind met us. No figure, no prints. Only the drifting fog and the distant bark of a dog. The next morning we visited the village registry office. Holmes requested access to old military records and land deeds. "What he found stunned even him, Elias Trigg," he murmured, scanning the yellow document listed as dead in 1879, but no grave, no funeral, no estate claimed. "Only a missing persons report from Sir Reginald Brackenmore." I blinked. "The same Reginald who now owns the property." Holmes nodded. Grimly, Trigg and Silas served together. Trigg disappears. Silas becomes the gardener. Sir Reginald buys the estate shortly after. "You think the judge is involved?" "I think," Holmes said, "that this case has roots far deeper than we thought." Holmes and I returned to the Brackenmore estate just past noon, our boots crunching over gravel slick with last night's rain. The judge greeted us in his drawing room, seated beneath an oil portrait of himself in full regalia, a crimson robe, a gavel in hand, and an expression colder than any verdict. "Back so soon, Mr. Holmes," he said, voice taut with forced courtesy. Holmes didn't sit. "Sir Reginald, what can you tell me about a man named Elias Trigg?" The judge's eyes flicked toward me, then back to Holmes. His fingers tightened around the arm of his chair. "That name hasn't been spoken in this house for decades. I suggest you let it rest." "Let me assure you, sir," Holmes said quietly, "it has not rested, not in the minds of those who knew him, nor in the soil beneath your greenhouse." The judge's jaw flexed, a tremor in the silence. "I don't know what you think you've found." "I know what someone buried," Holmes interrupted, "and I know that Trigg was declared missing shortly after returning from India, where he and Silas Green served in the same regiment. I know that you purchased this estate shortly after his disappearance, and that the only witness left alive, Silas, has now vanished." Sir Reginald stood abruptly. "You are skating dangerously close to accusation, Holmes." Holmes stepped forward, quiet but unrelenting. "You summoned me here, Sir Reginald. If you wish me to stop, all you need do is admit why." The judge's expression crumpled for a fraction of a second, then stiffened again, regal and cold. "I summoned you," he said flatly, "because a man disappeared from my property. That is all." He turned toward the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. Holmes studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked out without another word. I followed. Back in our guest room, Holmes paced like a caged animal. "He's hiding something," he muttered. "And it's not guilt in the conventional sense. It's fear of what might now be uncovered." "Do you think he killed Trigg?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. "I think he knows why Trigg died, and that knowledge has anchored him to this place ever since." Just then, a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Plymley entered with tea. but her face was pale, hands trembling slightly. "There's something you should see," she whispered. We followed her to the back of the house, down a narrow hallway lined with dust-covered paintings. At the end was a door we had not noticed before. It opened with a groan, revealing a cramped study. Books stacked high, a mahogany desk littered with half-burned letters. Mrs. Plymley pointed to a drawer I clean here sometimes. I shouldn't have looked, but something felt wrong. I found this. Holmes opened the drawer. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and brittle. The initials. E.T. embossed on the corner. Holmes opened to the first page. "If this reaches another man's eyes, may he judge my sins fairly." I buried what I should not have touched. But it was not greed, it was fear and debt. He flipped through entries, dates, accounts, sketches of strange symbols, and then a single name repeated over and over again. Rosegate. "What the devil is Rosegate?" I murmured. Holmes didn't reply. His gaze was fixed on a torn page, only half legible. Sir Reginald insisted we dig only at night, said it had to be moved before they came asking. Watson stepped closer. Before who came, Holmes closed the journal. "We're not looking at a disappearance anymore," he said. "We're looking at a cover-up over something that was never meant to be found." Outside the window the clouds began to churn, casting dark shadows over the estate. And in the greenhouse, the crimson widow continued to bloom untouched by time. Rain had begun to fall in earnest by the time we returned to the village. The cobblestones shimmered beneath gas lamps, and water dripped from the eaves in rhythmic, hypnotic intervals. Holmes led the way to the local parish archives, a modest stone building nestled beside the chapel, its windows flickering with candlelight. The clerk, an elderly man with spectacles that magnified his eyes like saucers, welcomed us with wary confusion. "We're looking for any record," Holmes said briskly, "of an estate, business or name, Rosegate. Perhaps something from 20 years ago, land deeds, legal disputes, anything?" The clerk furrowed his brow, scratching his balding head. "Rosegate, you say? That's not a common name in these parts." He disappeared into the back room, the sound of shuffling parchment echoing like distant footsteps. After several long minutes he returned holding a slim leather-bound book. "This here is the village council ledger from 1873, he said. There was only one mention. Holmes seized the book. The entry was brief, but enough. Parcel 19, Rosegate Nurseries. Land sold to private party. Buyer Reginald Brackenmore. Cash transaction. No public bidding." Holmes tapped the page. "There it is. He bought this land under a false name and buried the transaction behind a shell nursery." I leaned closer. "Why would he do that? And why grow flowers?" Holmes stared at the entry in silence. Then quietly he closed the book. "Because sometimes, Watson, the best place to hide the dead is beneath beauty." We left the archives and returned to the Brackenmore grounds in darkness. Lantern in hand, Holmes led us not toward the greenhouse, but into the orchard, toward a fenced-off area marked by an old rotting signpost. Its paint had faded almost entirely, but the lettering was still faintly visible. Rosegate. The soil here was oddly elevated, mounded, as though hiding something beneath. At the far edge, a stone marker jutted out crookedly from the ground, almost swallowed by ivy. Holmes knelt beside it, brushing away the vines. "Look at this," he whispered. The stone was unmarked, no name, no date, just a floral emblem carved into the center, the same one from the key. Holmes stood slowly. "This entire property is a grave," he said. "But the question is, who's back at the house?" Holmes examined the journal again. He flipped past the military entries and sketches, until he found a final page tucked deep within the back cover. It was a receipt, folded and yellowed, from a pawnbroker in London. It listed 2 items sold by E. Trigg. Gold locket. Field officer's revolver, unloaded. "Why would Trigg pawn a weapon?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed because he didn't need it anymore. Or he was trading protection for silence. Before dawn, we questioned Mrs. Plymley again. Holmes asked her if she had ever heard the word Rosegate in the house. She hesitated. "It used to be what the back orchard was called," she said, "before Sir Reginald had the sign taken down." Said it reminded him of old debts. Debts to whom she looked away. His brother Holmes froze. Sir Reginald had a brother. "Yes," she whispered. "Victor Brackenmore. Younger. Went missing. Years ago." Watson leaned in. "No one ever searched." There was no need, she said quietly. Sir Reginald told everyone Victor had left for the colonies. She looked up at us, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't think Victor ever left. I think he's still here. Outside, a branch snapped in the wind, and inside the house, a door creaked open on its own. The following morning broke with a heavy fog that clung low over the garden, smothering sound and blurring shapes into ghostly outlines. The Brackenmore estate felt suspended in time, quiet, damp, and strangely watchful. Holmes was already dressed and pacing by the window when I awoke. Watson, he said, without looking at me. How does one conceal a murder without burying the body? I blinked sleep from my eyes. Hide it in plain sight. Holmes turned, nodding. Or build your life upon it so thoroughly that no one dares question what lies beneath. We made our way once more to the orchard, lanterns cutting through the white curtain of fog. Holmes carried with him a small steel rod and a stethoscope, tools he used rarely, and only for what he called the more secretive truths of soil. At the farthest mound in the Rosegate orchard, he drove the rod deep into the earth. A dull thud echoed back, hollow beneath. He muttered a cavity. Likely bricked. Holmes stepped back and gestured for me to follow. We're digging. We borrowed 2 shovels from the greenhouse and began to dig. The soil was loamy, damp, and gave way more easily than expected. After a few minutes, we struck something solid. It was a slab. Stone, flat, and clearly unnatural. Holmes cleared the surface, revealing an iron ring embedded in its center. He looked at me. Helped me lift it. Together, with strained effort, we heaved the slab free. Beneath it lay a narrow stairwell, descending into the earth. The air that rushed up was foul, mildewed and metallic, heavy with rot. Holmes lit his lantern. We descend. The stairs led to a chamber, small and square, with brick walls and a vaulted ceiling. It was older than the house above, likely part of the original estate foundations. At its center stood a stone table, and upon it, a skeleton. Partially clothed in a deteriorated military coat, the remains were positioned with hands folded across the chest. A rusted field officer's revolver lay beside it. Holmes knelt silently. From the coat pocket he retrieved a faded locket. Inside was a miniature painting of 2 young boys, one unmistakably Sir Reginald. The other, we could only assume, was Victor. Holmes opened his notebook and wrote 2 names. Victor Brackenmore, presumed deceased, circa 1874 to 1876. Cause of death, unknown, interred beneath Rosegate orchard. Someone staged this, Holmes said finally. This wasn't a hurried burial. This was ritual. Symbolic. He pointed to the floral emblem etched into the stone table. The same motif. Whoever placed him here wanted him remembered, but hidden. As we ascended, a voice called from the garden, urgent, frantic. It was Constable Merrow. They found Silas. We rushed toward the main road, where a hay wagon had come to a halt. Lying across its rear bed, covered by a tarp, was a man, bearded, filthy, but alive. It was Silas Green. His eyes fluttered open weakly as Holmes bent beside him. Silas, he said softly. Who did this to you? Silas blinked, his lips cracked. I tried to stop them. Tried to warn him. Warn who? Silas looked up with horror. Voice barely a whisper. They're coming for it now, for what's underneath. And then, he lost consciousness. Holmes stood, grave. The chamber wasn't just a grave, Watson. It's a gate. And someone's just opened it. Silas Green remained unconscious for hours, guarded by the local constable and attended by the village doctor. Holmes, however, was restless. He paced across the drawing room of Brackenmore House, eyes flicking to the window every few minutes as if expecting the fog outside to peel back and reveal the truth. It doesn't add up, he muttered. Victor Brackenmore dies, yet not reported. Elias Trigg disappears. No grave, no will. Silas buries documents, protects secrets, and then is attacked. And now we find an underground chamber with a single corpse, and the word Rosegate scrawled across every clue like a cryptic refrain. I glanced up from the journal we'd recovered. There was another sketch in the back, I said, flipping toward the final page. It looks like a tunnel. Holmes leaned in. The sketch was rough, more a map than a drawing. It showed the estate from above, the orchard, the greenhouse, and a dotted line that curved beneath the grounds, ending at the base of the old well behind the stables. Holmes narrowed his eyes. The well. Of course we crossed the muddy courtyard, lanterns in hand, to where the stone well stood crumbling and overgrown with moss. A rusted pulley dangled from the top, rope frayed and half snapped. Holmes crouched beside it, inspecting the base. "Not used in years," he said. "But look here, the brickwork on the south side. Newer, just like the frame in the greenhouse." With my help, he cleared the overgrowth. Behind the vines was a false panel, cleverly crafted. A small iron latch clicked open, revealing a narrow passage carved directly into the earth. The air that drifted out was cold, ancient. "Are you armed?" Holmes asked me. "Always," I replied, patting my coat pocket. We entered. The tunnel curved downward, lit only by our lanterns. The walls were reinforced with wood beams and lined with root systems that had grown around the stone. After some 30 yards, the path opened into a crude underground vault. It was larger than the chamber beneath the orchard. There were no bodies here, but there were crates. Dozens of them, sealed with wax and marked with faded British military stamps. Holmes opened the nearest. Inside, ledgers, maps and strange artifacts wrapped in muslin, objects of clearly Eastern origin, jade amulets, brass instruments. One box contained scrolls so delicate they nearly disintegrated in our hands. "Looted relics," Holmes whispered. Trig and Victor were involved in something during their time in India. Something they weren't supposed to bring home. He lifted one document, a contract signed in both English and Hindustani. The seal at the bottom bore a crest with a snake wrapped around a lotus. "Watson, this isn't just a personal crime. This is international theft." At that moment, a sound echoed behind us. A voice, low, calm and chilling. "You shouldn't have come here." We turned. Sir Reginald Brackenmore stood at the tunnel mouth, lantern in hand, pistol raised. His face was gaunt, shadowed by flame. But there was no madness in his eyes. Only resolve. "I buried my brother. I paid the price. But what's in those crates that was never supposed to come to light?" Holmes raised a hand slowly. "You knew what they brought back. You helped them hide it." "I had to," Reginald whispered. "Victor was obsessed. He believed the relics were cursed, said they followed him home. He wouldn't stop talking about shadows, whispers in the orchard, the rose that bloomed on its own. He stepped forward, gun trembling. "When he died, I thought it would end. But then Trig tried to sell them, and Silas started asking questions. Now you." Quote, "Lower the weapon, Reginald," I said softly. "This doesn't have to end in another death." But he shook his head. "You don't understand. Some things, some legacies, are too dangerous to survive." He cocked the pistol. And Holmes whispered, "Now, Watson." I lunged forward, striking his arm as the shot rang out. The bullet ricocheted into the crates. Holmes tackled him to the ground. Reginald struggled for a moment, then went limp. Years of secrets and guilt crashing down at once. Holmes stood, breathing hard. "Call the constable," he said. "This man has protected a vault of imperial sins for 20 years. Sir Reginald Brackenmore was arrested before sunrise. Constable Merrow, though visibly shaken by the discovery of the underground vault, carried out the duty with quiet professionalism." Holmes gave his full statement. I assisted Silas back to his cottage, where the old gardener stirred weakly under blankets and murmured apologies to ghosts only he could see. By mid-morning the fog had lifted. The estate seemed different, lighter somehow, though the secrets buried beneath its soil would never fully loosen their grip. Holmes stood once more before the crimson widow rose, its petals still immaculate, despite the chaos that had unfolded. "I misjudged him," he said softly. "Sir Reginald. No, Silas," he turned to me. "He didn't just bury the truth, he preserved it, protected it. He wanted it found, but only when the time was right." I looked back at the greenhouse. "So what happens now?" "The British Museum will likely claim the relics," Holmes said with a sigh. "There will be inquiries, tribunals. Sir Reginald may confess to more than we already know, or he may let silence guard the rest. Either way, the shadow of Rosegate will outlive all of us." He paused, then added, "But justice, of a kind, has bloomed." Quote. We returned to Baker Street that evening. Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet. though his fingers twitched with restless thought. As he sat by the fire, I handed him a fresh cup of tea and said, "You know, there's still something about that rose." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "It bloomed through death, through lies, through silence." "Why that one flower?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Because, Watson, every great mystery needs one perfect symbol." He lifted the cup. "And some truths, once planted, never truly die." A long silence passed. Then, as the fire crackled and the London rain began once more against the glass, Holmes said, "Tell me, Watson, when men hide their sins beneath beauty, is it cowardice or conscience?" I didn't answer. Some questions are best left to roses. 2 days later, while I was organizing old notes back at Baker Street, a letter arrived. Its seal was simple. Red wax pressed with a floral emblem. No return address. I turned it over in my hands before Holmes took it silently and opened it with a thin-bladed knife. Inside was a single sheet, yellowed at the edges. It had no salutation, no signature, just 4 short lines in fine cursive. "The Crimson Widow was never bred. She bloomed where something else bled. The man you seek was never gone. He walked the garden all along." Holmes read it twice, then folded it precisely and tucked it into his jacket. "Well," he said, "it seems someone else still walks among the roots." "You think it's Silas?" I asked. "Unlikely. He's under watch. This handwriting is younger, deliberate. It speaks of knowledge without guilt." He rose. "I believe the ghost of Rosegate isn't done yet." The next train to Farncombe was scheduled within the hour. We arrived by early evening and found the estate eerily still. Silas's cottage was quiet. The constable reported no further disturbances. But Mrs. Plymley met us at the greenhouse gate, her face pale. "There was someone in the orchard last night," she said, "a figure in dark clothes. He walked the rows of soil, stopped at Victor's grave, and placed something on the stone." We followed her into the mist-laced orchard. At the far end, near the crooked marker, a small bundle lay in the grass. Holmes knelt beside it. Wrapped in cloth was a book. The cover was leather, worn to softness. No title. Inside were pages filled with writing, entries spanning decades. It was a diary, not of Trigg, not of Silas, but of Victor Brackenmore. Holmes flipped through the first entries, fragments of his service in India, reflections on strange dreams, sketches of the relics he and Trigg had found. The entries shifted in tone quickly, moving from excitement to dread. "The rose grew where blood fell. It watched us dig. Trigg hears voices in the trees. I hear them in the walls. I tried to burn it. It bloomed again." Page after page, the obsession with the rose, and something it represented, grew. Near the end, an entry chilled me to the bone. "I never left. I only became the gardener." I stared at Holmes. "But Silas is the gardener." Holmes closed the book slowly. "Then either Victor wrote this before handing over the roll, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Because just then, a whisper drifted through the orchard. Soft, rustling, like someone speaking through the leaves. We both turned, but there was no one. Only the rose bushes and the wind, and among them, one more bloom than yesterday. That same night, Holmes requested to examine the parish death records. Again, the clerk, now quite familiar with our inquiries, obliged without question, though he raised an eyebrow when Holmes asked for the burial registers dating back to 1860. "You believe Victor Brackenmore may have had another identity?" I whispered, as we waited. Holmes nodded. "If the diary is accurate, and Victor remained on the estate after his supposed disappearance, it's possible he re-entered the world under a different name." The clerk returned with the requested volumes. Holmes flipped through them with astonishing speed, scanning pages line by line. Then he stopped here, he said, pointing to an entry dated 1877. "Name, Elijah Venn. Occupation, horticulturalist. Cause of death, unknown. Declared deceased after 10 years missing. Last known address, Brackenmore Estate, groundskeeper cottage." "But that's—" "Yes," Holmes said, "the same cottage Silas lived in. Before Silas ever came to the estate, this Elijah Venn lived there. Then vanished. Declared dead after a decade of silence." He looked up. "This is Victor, an alias. He faked his disappearance, then lived beneath his brother's nose for years." I frowned, but why would Reginald allow it? Surely he knew. "He did," Holmes said. and likely used that secret to keep Victor under control. We left the registry and returned to the estate once more. This time, Holmes didn't go to the greenhouse or the orchard. He went to the cellar beneath the main house. I noticed it on the first day, he said, locked, unused. But old foundations don't lie. Mrs. Plymley brought us the keys. The judge, now in holding, could not protest. The door creaked open with a sigh. We descended stone steps into darkness, the air thick with mildew. Cobwebs shrouded the corners. At the far wall, a wooden shelf collapsed under years of dust and neglect. Behind it, another door. Holmes hesitated only a moment before pushing it open. The hidden room was small, windowless, with a table, a chair, and an oil lamp still half full. On the wall hung a single painting, dust-covered, but unmistakably a portrait of Victor Brackenmore. Below it, a stack of letters. Dozens. All addressed, curiously, to Elijah Venn. Holmes opened one, then another. They're all written to someone called the Curator. Descriptions of dreams, of the Crimson Widow, of hearing voices beneath the soil. He turned to me, face pale. These were never sent. These were records. A confession no one asked for. A sharp knock echoed from upstairs. We startled. A constable's voice called from above. Telegram for Mr. Holmes. Holmes rushed up. The telegram was brief. Vault breached. Crates missing. Unknown figures fled museum. He froze. It's not over, he said quietly. Someone else wants what Victor buried. And they've just stolen it. Outside, the wind began to howl, and in the orchard, petals began to fall. That evening, Holmes paced like a caged lion. The crates from the underground vault, he muttered. They were supposed to be sealed, catalogued. That breach wasn't opportunistic. It was premeditated. Someone has waited years for this. I sat across from him in silence. The timing, I said finally, it can't be coincidence. We uncover the vault. The story surfaces. And within days, the relics vanish. Holmes turned toward the fireplace. Jaw tight, Watson, remember the diary. The letters to the curator. What if that wasn't a metaphor, but a real person? You think someone has been watching this estate all along? Not just watching, Holmes said, waiting. Guiding, he pulled out the final page from Victor's diary, one I hadn't seen. It was torn, written hastily. If he comes again, I will not stop him. I no longer believe this land is ours to defend. The rose is not ours. It remembers its first owner. Holmes whispered the next words aloud. The collector has returned, I shivered. Just then, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Plymley peeked in, her hands shaking. There's someone here to see you, sir. Said you'd be expecting him. Holmes rose slowly. We stepped into the front hall. Standing beneath the old chandelier was a tall man in a grey coat, wide-brimmed hat, shadowing his face. He removed his gloves slowly, revealing thin, pale hands. Mr. Holmes, he said with a faint accent, or should I say, seeker of what should stay buried. Holmes tilted his head, and you are the man smiled. I am merely an archivist. A steward. I collect what is forgotten. And return it where it belongs. Holmes didn't blink. You took the relics. I reclaimed them. Holmes stepped forward. What were they? The man raised an eyebrow. You think they were cursed? Haunted? Touched by superstition. He leaned slightly forward. They were warnings. From those your empire silenced. Holmes remained still. And the rose? The rose is a guardian, the man said, voice calm. It grows where memory bleeds. And it only blooms when the land is ready to remember. The silence in the hallway stretched. Then the man turned, placing a sealed envelope on the table beside the door. For the gardener. He will understand. Without another word, he stepped out into the rain and vanished down the path. Holmes waited until the figure had disappeared beyond the gate before opening the envelope. Inside was a single pressed petal and a note. The land has chosen its witness. Let him tend it well. That night Holmes stood once more in the orchard. The Crimson Widow glowed in the moonlight, untouched by weather, time, or man, and beside it, a second rose had begun to bloom. We stayed in Farncombe one final night. Silas, having regained some strength, walked with us slowly through the orchard in the grey light before dawn. His eyes fell upon the second rose, small, fragile, but unmistakably the same blood red as the Crimson Widow. "She's never bloomed a sister before," he whispered. Holmes stood silently beside him. "She has now," he said. "Perhaps because you've finally spoken the truth aloud." Silas nodded faintly, then placed the pressed petal from the letter at the base of the new rose. It fluttered once, caught by a breeze that didn't seem to touch anything else. We returned to Baker Street that afternoon. The papers, of course, never told the full story. They mentioned the underground vault, the military artifacts, the arrest of a prominent judge. But the rose, the legacy of the phantom gardener, was never mentioned. Holmes, as always, kept only one memento, the final page from Victor Brackenmore's diary. It now rested beneath the glass of our sitting-room table. The ink had faded slightly, but the words remained legible. "Memory must bloom where silence was sown." Weeks later, as London settled into autumn, I found Holmes staring out at the window one morning. "No news from the museum?" I asked. He shook his head. The artifacts were never recovered. The man in the grey coat was never identified. No record. No name. As if history itself had agreed to let him pass unnoticed. He paused, and perhaps that's fitting. I sat across from him. "But there's still one question I can't answer." Holmes looked at me. "Who was the rose watching all along? Victor? Trig?" Reginald Holmes's voice was quiet. "I don't believe it watched them, Watson. I believe it watched us." He tapped the glass above the diary page, "And perhaps it still does." A long silence passed between us, broken only by the soft tick of the mantel clock. Then Holmes leaned back in his chair. "I must say, Watson, there are few cases stranger than this one," I agreed. "And yet, I could not help but feel that somewhere, far from Baker Street, in a garden still half-shadowed and overgrown, a third rose was waiting to bloom." If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe. More chilling cases, more brilliant deductions, only on the Detective Files.